Talk about pressure on the congressman. When do you remember Tip O'Neill starting to tell him, let's move this along, please?
Oh, it came early. And again, relationships and trust became very important because Tip O'Neill has shown great encouragement in supporting Rodino's choice to lead this investigation in the Judiciary Committee. But Tip O'Neill was a man of action, and he and Rodino was a very methodical person, and those always didn't match up well. So on a regular basis, the large Tip O'Neill and the diminutive Peter Rodino would be getting together, and Tip would be putting his finger on him, saying, "Peter, we have to move this process along, you know." And Peter would say, "Yes, I understand. And this went on a regular basis, both informally, and then when the chairman would be called over to the Speaker's office, formally, that this process had to move forward. And each time, again, being, as it turns out historically, they're all great master politicians, he bought more time. He could always buy more time. And because it's not that he said, he'd go to the staff, he'd go to John Doerr and to the staff and say, what he had to do was give them the time. So he was extremely protective of the staff because they had to do that work isolated from the pressures, the political pressures. Even though we started this conversation, this is a political process. He wanted them away from that pressure. So whatever had to be absorbed, he would take that pressure, or other key members, other allies, but no pressure on the staff. And there was constant efforts to put pressure on the staff, where they would call John Doerr and others that, what's going on. And of course, John, as we know, was one of the more discreet people in the world. But there's enormous pressure. It's just, from a personal point of view, it taught me just watching congressmen just how to deal with pressure. He just absorbed it. And I think, did it bother him? Yes, it bothered him. I mean, he's human. But he felt the process was so important that this had to be done in a way, in the end, that was considered bipartisan or nonpartisan. And that he felt that that you could not rush this.
Did he get a little impatient at any point with Mr.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. That's another story.
Well,
yes.
no, let's hear it.
But yes, because John was so methodical and so cautious. John was very cautious. And many evening, John would come over and, in his way, I hope you get a chance to talk to him, and just an extraordinary human being. But yes, he would, and the chairman would say, I think, in his way, he would say, I think we have to move this process on. And then once in a while he would ask me to help, if I could sit and talk to John and help the process. And the answer was usually no, that John needed the time he needed. And, there was some give, but again, deep respect. I mean, that's the key word. He respected John. He respected the staff. He respected what they felt. And he was willing to take the pressure.
And so the pressure would come from his fellow committee members, in addition to Tip O'Neill.
Jeez.
Do you remember?
First and foremost.
Do you remember who were some of the tough ones, for tougher ones to have to do?
Well, on both sides. On the Republican side, you had people like Congressman Sandman. I think he was from New Jersey, he was way out there. But there were more important Republicans. There was a congressman from California.
Wiggins,
very important, who Congressman deeply respected, and you know, he was a very strong supporter of the president, of President Nixon, very strong supporter. And he was putting enormous pressure. Let's move this, let's conclude this. This is being dragged on, this is partisan, this was, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And respect had to be paid there. On the other side, you had sort of a young Congressman Conyers, you had Congressman Waldley from California, you had Father Drinan, you had Jack Brooks, first and foremost, very powerful figure in the House and on the committee, just putting enormous pressure on the congressman on a regular basis. Bring this to a conclusion. Let's get some articles. Let's get some votes here. And it's looking back on it, you say how he held this together, just by sheer force of personality. And you could never be. He was never confrontational. You couldn't get him in an argument. So it's sort of the worst kind of opponent to have. You couldn't draw him out. And because he just would absorb it. He would listen to you. He would understand you, and then he would answer you and have no idea what he said. You constantly never knew what he said. So members, it wasn't me or anybody else, no, because he would just talk in these riddles. And it was just extraordinary. And you just didn't know, did he say we're going to move forward or not?
Give us an example.
Well, I can't remember anymore. It's so hard. But I remember it's sort of, you had to get what we used to call the chairman speak. You had to understand, you had to come out of a meeting and say, okay, now this is what he meant. And because he just never said anything directly to you. He never.
But he knew what he wanted, right?
Exactly. He knew exactly what he wanted. He was telling you, but he never told you in a direct way. And I guess one of the reasons I got hired was because I sort of understood, I guess, what he was saying, and could understand him very well, actually. No, he was very sure what he was saying. He just never said it in a way that, say, you and I would say something. But his outreach was extraordinary. He felt that he had to keep lines of communication to a broad spectrum of the membership on the committee. And in those days, remember, a chairman was a very powerful figure, and rank was very important. You're a freshman, you know. You're lucky you ever got to speak to the chairman. On the Republican side, every once in a while he'd invite Congressman Cohen from Maine up to his office to get his thoughts. He'd invite Barbara Jordan up, Charlie Rangel. These were all freshmen. These were all. And then on a regular basis, which I don't think many people knew, that I was sent out on a regular basis to meet with a group of members just to make sure that they felt that they were being connected to the congressman. So Congressman Flowers from, I believe, Alabama, Congressman Mann. These all became very critical people. He already identified in his mind very early that who was really important here in terms of that would have an important public impact. In other words, how these people voted, yay or nay, would become very important in the outcome. Didn't know how they'd vote at the time, but he felt it was very important that they trust him, that they felt that both personal contact and a rare contact from myself and others, that they had a line that they felt their voices were being heard. So, I mean, this was never reported or anything, but on a regular basis, I would make the rounds of members, and you know, just talk to them. Wasn't a lawyer. Didn't talk particularly about the case. They would tell me what they thought, and which I would then come back to the member, and we come back to the congressman. He would have phone conversations with them, fight them over. So all this was his way of keeping his committee members intact, and in a very low key way, where they had to, again, you had to put a, because you know these people's lives, their political lives were at stake. They had to put a lot of trust in him, and you know, they have their own lives, their own political lives to worry about, And they knew this was an extraordinary undertaking with had the whole nation's attention. So they had to trust him, and he had to build that trust up.
This group that you go and see, did you see them individually or as a group?
No, individual.
Do they include the group that would be the swing Republicans like Hogan and Railsback, or were you just meeting with the Southern Democrats?
Mostly Southern Democrats.
In the beginning, where were they leaning, or were they leaning anywhere on the issue of the
I think very reluctant. Very, very reluctant on both sides of the aisle. I mean, the early readings, and again, Congress would never ask the question. He would never, because you'd never want somebody to answer. And I've learned from him, never ask a question till you know the answer. So he would never ask them, how are you leaning? That question would never come up in any forum. But his political instincts, he understood these people were very, very reluctant to bring any charge against a president of the United States. It didn't matter who the president was. There was some partisanship there, but you had a very skeptical center audience that he thought were key. So his conclusion very early on was, they're going to decide. It's this group that you talked about, Republicans and Democrats. We're going to decide this issue, and that they either felt the case against the president was substantial or not, and that was the strategy from day one.
In the beginning, and it's a long time ago, do you think it mattered to the chairman which direction they went?
No. He was, it sounds, he was a patriot. He really was a patriot. He was a great institutionalist. And he thought, it's almost like being picked for a jury. I don't know if you ever picked for a jury. All of a sudden, you take on this responsibility. You go, oh my God, I'm a juror. And I think that's the way the Congress looked at this. That this extraordinary duty was thrust upon him, and that was more than anything he ever thought about in his life or prepared for. And he did not know what the outcome would be, which I thought was, I mean, again, that's why it turned out historically he was the right person. You would not know that going down the line of, who you're going to pick. That's the fate. It's, that his demeanor, his intellectual strengths, his institutional belief, his sense of being, being from immigrant roots, he was extraordinarily patriotic, and that you would be charged with this task of potentially taking the President of the United States was in some ways unimaginable to him at the beginning. It was unimaginable. And yet, as he said, once the process begins, it had to have a conclusion.
Mr. Dorr begins to present the statements of information, May 9th. So now we've been at it for some months, a lot of pressure. Finally, the material is coming out. Again, I've read that a number of the members were just bored and confused. In the beginning, how did the chairman view the process as Mr. Dorr began to lay out the information?
He thought it was too, it wasn't crisp, too legal, too, again, these are all lawyers, but it was too dense. And lawyers overwrite anything. So, and I think that was his, and that's a rather flip statement, but he said, this has to be understandable. He said, but it has to be understandable to the members. It's more important, this has to be understood to the American citizens. This is just not understandable. Because you have to make these points that you just mentioned understandable to the members and eventually to the American public. So go back. And over time, these had to be these had to be made more. These had to be made more understandable.
For 6 weeks? Mr. Dorff, do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. There's just a lot of pressure. There was a lot of pressure, and there was a lot of back and forth. And remember, you're dealing with 100 and some lawyers here. It was, you know, it was difficult. And again, what we said in the beginning, this is a political process. This is not a legal process.
So does Mr. Dorr then, he finally gives a much more impassioned
Yes.
speech.
Yes.
Some have said it's because the chairman talked to him.
Well, I think the chairman had many conversations. He and John had many conversations, and I think Mr. Dorr decided he just would.
Would you remember that moment?
I remember that moment.
Please tell us.
Well, I mean, I just remember that it's one of those conversations in the evening. He said, you know, you just have to, that expression wasn't used in those days, but Jesus, you just have to step this up. You just have to, he said, you have to do something at that table. And, you know, you have to, again, he never talked this way. That's the thing about it. But John Dorr fully understood that this was it, that he had to make the case to these members. Whatever the case would be, he had to make the case. And I think John sort of went home and processed that and came back, and there's a lot of back and forth.
Given how important this was in this history of the case, did the congressman present, there was a famous congressman speech, or chairman speech,
Mm-hmm.
but did he show emotion when he would?
Oh yes, there was emotion here. First and foremost, Peter Rodin was Italian, so he's very measured. But there were times where he could get emotional in this measured way. There was no doubt that John and staff understood what had to be done, and I think that was the relation. But again, by then there was such incredible trust between them. Great differences of opinion. Why wouldn't there be? I mean, again, these were monumental decisions. These were on. I remember the night, moving off your subject for a minute, I remember the night we had to send a letter to the president. I mean, the debate went deep into the night. I mean, do you actually send a letter to the President of the United States? I mean, this is kind of, every day we had to make these kind of decisions. These were not, we had no guidance. So all of these things, every issue, every legal issue, every political, had to be discussed, thought through, talked out. And you're dealing with a intellectually powerful staff on both sides of the aisle, just powerful, intellectually powerful people in terms of their intellectual heft. And then you had to sort of bring that political process into this. So there was a lot of there was a lot of debate. This was not, there was nothing, I don't think there was an easy day in this process, from the day it began to the day it ended.
On the story of the letter, this comes after the White House has issued its transcripts.
Right.
And I've interviewed former Senator Cohen, who wanted to participate in the letter.
Brought to the chairman's office.
And this was a really hard event for him because he felt sort of left in the cold here. Do you remember? It must have been. He was your only, at that point, your only Republican ally on this particular issue.
Correct.
I think.
Right. And he had been courted by, in other words, courted is the wrong word, but he certainly had access to Congressman. There had been conversations, and because Congressman, again, he thought he'd be an important, you know, even though he was a young member, he thought that Mr. Cohen could be helpful to the process.
But in the end, Cohen's draft of the letter is not the one that was sent.
No, it wasn't.
You're smiling.
It just wasn't, that's all. It's called politics.
the Democratic members needed to be satisfied.
Correct. And also, I think the Congressman decided what the correct letter had to be. And, but he was deeply appreciative of Congressman Cohen's input.
Let's talk a bit about the tapes. Did you listen to any of them?
Mm-hmm.
What effect did they have on you?
Not much, actually. I tried. The Congressman asked me a couple times to listen to tapes. And I tried not to, in this process, again, this was going back, I tried not to get, I didn't want to get personal. In other words, I wanted to keep a distance in this. You know, someone remarked to me, and you know, which I think is a compliment that I totally forgot. They said, you know, you never said an anti-Nixon word ever. There was a reporter said that to me all these years later. They were telling me, I had dinner with a reporter years ago. I mean, recently, Elizabeth Drew, who covered the event from New Yorker at the time. She says, you know, all those years, all those times we covered you, you never said a word about Nixon, ever. And I think that came from the chairman. It also came from a personal, not that I didn't have a view, but I think it was my place to be talking. But to get there, you had to keep some distance. So I wasn't actually very curious about the tapes. In other words, there was enormous curiosity, you know, and I wasn't that curious. It wasn't my job. It wasn't where I fit in. You know, people weren't asking nobody on the committee was going to ask me what I thought of the tapes. And so I sort of stayed out what wasn't mine, so to speak. So I didn't have any opinion. And then I've never even thought about listening to him again. It's just
the chairman listened to some tapes.
Yes, he did. He was bothered.
Can you tell us more?
Well, he's bothered by the language. He's bothered by sort of the tone, the same thing, but it's the same reaction as everyone. I think he was surprised about President Nixon. I think the tapes, a lot of tapes surprised him. And a lot of the tapes, I mean, some of the tapes, he'd come back and we talk a little about it at night. He was bothered, I thought. He didn't think some of the things were, again, Peter was very proper. He just think some of the things were very proper language and that, but we never talked about, nor did he ever comment about sort of the substance of the case. The substance of the tapes. But I could tell you just bothered by some of the tapes, the condition of the president, etc.
Did you see a sort of a shift in his position?
No. No. There's just, in other words, whatever he and I talked about never went beyond he and I. And it just, you know, from day one to that last day, it's just not what his views were. But he tried to keep that, you know, intellectually as best as he could, he tried to keep centered.
Was it hard for him to keep centered?
Not really. It sort of fit his personality. In other words, he was not very obviously a strong Democrat, but he was not very partisan. So it didn't fit his personality. And I think the obligation so overwhelmed him and put such a weight on him, and I think an important quality all of us had then, he was very fearful in the sense that of not doing the right thing. And I think fear is a wonderful emotion to have in a time like this, that it keeps you on track. So he didn't have time sort of to get out and, you know, and be bothered by this. He just was, the whole thing was so overwhelming.
As you were out, like, if you, pardon, I apologize for the analogy, but you were a little like the canary in the mine shaft. When you were out talking to these conservative Democrats,
mm-hmm.
When did you start seeing a shift? Because they're talking to you about what they're thinking, and obviously they're going to vote. They ultimately vote against President Nixon. Is it slow?
It's very slow. It's a very slow process. And we talk about that, but never publicly, never to the staff, to John's staff, actually, about where we thought these people were. That was a conversation that was very deeply held. And it may have gone, though I have no knowledge, it may have gone to the speaker or to something like that, but he never, I mean, we sort of knew where the case was at a certain point.
The voting starts on July 27th. Francis, it's a long time ago, but did you think you had a majority for an Article 1?
Yes.
Did you think that a month before, or was it a week before?
I don't remember. It was, I don't remember when, but we had talked about it as those nights approached, those days approached, that he thought that the case had been made. That's a better way to put it, actually. He thought the case had been made against the president. And he thought that the key center that he felt was so important, Republicans and Democrats, that they believed that the case had been made.
When Railsback and Cohen and Hogan are meeting with Flowers, is somebody telling you about that?
Flowers and I had a good relationship. Died very young. We had a good relationship. So we'd talk about, we'd get a sense of where people were. He talked to the chairman, Flowers would, not to me.
I've seen the images of the debate. Flowers would be very emotional.
Mm-hmm.
He was very emotional in the
Very.
debate. Tell us a little bit about other kinds of fears. This is a very tense Washington, isn't it?
Well, it was an incredible time. Look back on it. It's hard for Americans to think now. I mean, we had some of the most senior members of an administration, starting with the Justice Department, going to prison, being charged with serious crimes. And there was fear. There was fear on my part that we were going to go to jail. I mean, that sounds crazy, but I thought, man, these people put us in jail. They could do anything. I mean, you couldn't trust the FBI, you couldn't trust the Justice Department. I mean, you couldn't trust your government, was our feeling. That just, it didn't affect, because we were only interested in one thing. What did the president? In other words, we had to sort of separate all these out from our duty, but we're citizens. And, we're living in Washington, D.C., and, there's no doubt we felt we were all tapped and under some kinds of investigations. I mean, we just took that as a course. That's sort of the environment, and we just had to be extremely cautious on how we conduct our business.
Did you have some conversations outdoors so that you wouldn't be heard?
Oh, I had conversations everywhere. I don't remember. We just, you're just cautious on what you said. But I wasn't so worried about that. But I thought, again, I never served in government again. I thought this was the most. It was obviously an extraordinary experience, but I couldn't do that again. The pressure was just so overwhelming on everybody. Forget me. And I had the least of the pressure. It was on all these people, but it just was. You were drained at the end. It was just enormously draining, and not a very happy experience. It wasn't a very happy experience. There was nothing pleasurable about doing this. You don't look back and say, "Well, that was a great job." It wasn't a great job. It was. I thought and my responsibilities were, least of all, I was a young staffer. It was, you know, these members. I don't think anyone thought it was a great experience. I think they think historically they did, you know, an incredible thing, you know, to this process to go through, and that the American public accepted this process. But I never heard a member said, you know, they thought that this was, on a personal level, sort of one of their highlights.
Do you remember anything from the moments after Article 1 was passed? Where were you?
I think it was in the back. I was in the committee, probably. I don't remember. I just...
Did you... I wanted to know how the chairman looked.
He was exhausted, you know, and that's all been published. He came back and he cried after it was over, from just an emotional experience. It wasn't the only time he had cried during the process, but it was a very emotional night, that I remember. And,
can you recall another time he cried?
well, he's Italian, so he's very emotional, so he cried a number of times. I don't think, there were a couple other times that he had tears, sort of through the experience. I think the pressure, the emotion of the whole process, sort of the darkest days of this process when there was just a lot of pressure on all of us. But then there's another piece. When I told them that this was going to be televised, that's another story.